Thank you so much, Warren.
Okay, I'm going to start my share screen here. This is office hours, and we're going to be talking about business strategy, and the second session has to do more with business messaging. What is the winning coalition for universal care, and how does business fit into that? So just going to give you a quick look at the outline. We'll be talking about knowing why we need business support, assuming that you believe we do, knowing the mind of business owners and leaders through analyzing poll results, knowing the relationships of the winning partners, and knowing how business is changing, knowing how business might be affected depending on how universal care is designed. But first, I'm going to start with a question. Why do you want business support for universal care? And Betty, you can see people that I can't see. So if anybody would raise your hand, and like to hear from 2 or 3 people for a short answer to the question of why do you want business support for universal care?
Oh, because of donation and money, and we want them to get out of the way.
You want them to get out of the way. That's great. Okay, what else? Lauren, did you have a comment you wanted to say?
But the bottom line is, for me, for a business owner, and I've been a business owner, dealing with benefits and HR in a small business is really hard. And it's a lot of paperwork, and it's a lot of research, and it's a lot of taking money out of checks and moving it around. It affects every department, and it's a lot of work. And if it's gone, you'll have 3 things. You'll have less rigmarole in your business. You'll have a better benefit to offer because it's special, it's new, it's better. It really actually puts them above other workplaces because they're offering this extended healthcare. And third, all of us will be saving money. So we'll all be being able to buy more of their things. And then the one that no one cares about is we'll all be healthier.
So I'm actually going to thank you for sharing why you think business should support universal care.
Okay.
But I'm going to restate the question was, why do you want business support for universal care? Getting out of the way is a great answer for that. And I'm wondering, Barbara, do you have an answer to that? For why you want business to support it?
Yes, I do, because they're a more credible voice. If they were in favor of it, not all us do-gooders who, bleeding hearts and so forth, but they have a much more credible voice, even in my very progressive town. Our town council wants to hear from business people. They don't want to hear from the activists, the same old, I guess we call it the choir.
Thank you, Barbara. How about Marcia? Do you have something to share on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that other business people will listen to business people. I mean, so they can bring that cohort into our movement. And,
great, thank you.
They'll see everything that Lauren already said. I agree with.
Right, and then Tom Gottlieb.
Well, my understanding is that business employers care about their employees, and and to do competent work for the employees really makes a better relationship within the business. So I think that's one issue. The other piece is that as employees, we find that the employers really are not all that competent in selecting or advocating for their employees as they could be, and they need some help. And the partnership, I think, amongst the employer, employee, and the folks who supply the security of insurance need to work together.
Thank you. And Paul, did you have something to add?
Well, I just wanted to underscore that businesses, and Barb touched on this, they are a very respected and influential voice in the community. Our politicians do not ignore business voices when business voices speak up. So if we can sell business people on Medicare for All, they will turn around and they will probably do it 10 times better than what we can with
Thank you.
with other people. So
Yeah, thanks. Those were all good comments. Now, let's assume that society is a bell curve. This is what a stable, healthy society looks like. I've written the words liberal and conservative at the ends of the bell curves. I don't like the words very much because popular usage has muddied the meaning, because most of us aren't really all one way or all the other way on every issue, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to be. As a complete societal group, we're a combination of a desire to try new, unproven ideas and a desire to stick with old, more familiar concepts. Do you think that our society follows this nice bell curve? Anybody just shout out an answer? I hear you thinking that some of you are a bit skeptical, but let me say that even if this isn't exactly like we look right now, I think if we view ourselves as a healthy society, it's the first step in becoming one. So if I start with this curve, and onto the bell curve, we can draw the approximate locations of progressives, mainstream Democrats, mainstream business conservatives. Business people can have a wide range, but many of them are about where the arrow is placed. There are other groups that we could label on this graph, and that might be fun, but these are the three groups which will likely decide the future of healthcare reform. Now, historically, successful strategies for change have a way of looking like the winning target zone depicted here. Unsurprisingly, change often comes from the left side of the graph, but if the change is coming very far from the left, you lose the important mainstream crossover from the near right. The sweet spot requires that you have to give up a few progressives in order to draw significant support from moderate right side, including mainstream business conservatives and fiscal conservatives. This winning target zone, as shown here, is an approximate picture of Joe Biden's election. And when true healthcare reform is passed by voters in the first state, it's likely to look a lot like this. Now, for fun, I'm going to back up one slide. I want you to think about yourself, where you would put yourself on the graph. I'm kind of over here somewhere, kind of moderate conservative with some bright flashes of wild progressivism, but I'm mostly over here. With a few rare exceptions, people tend to stay in the same area of their curve most of their adult lives. There are exceptions of people who started out in one place on the curve, ended up in another place on the curve. They can be pretty interesting people. Now I'm going to ask a question just for you to think about for half a second. Where would you draw most healthcare advocacy organizations on this graph? Well, based on highly scientific process of counting Bernie stickers in the parking lot at single payer advocacy meetings in Oregon and elsewhere, I've drawn about here is where I think most healthcare advocacy organizations are, about where I drew it. I can think of people to the left and right of that, but this is about where I think they are, and it's neither an insult nor a compliment. So do you see any problem or challenges here relative to the winning target zone? But before I go further, I could hear some of you thinking that that maybe this isn't the shape that we are in the United States. So let's say that our society doesn't look like a healthy bell curve at all. Looks something like this, with almost no one in the center. In the recent presidential election, which broke all records, recent records for turnout, Joe Biden won about 51% of the vote. About 49% of the vote went to Donald Trump and a few other candidates. I can locate those three groups that I talked about earlier, the three critical legs of support. and about where they might be located on this map. In a bimodal situation like this, one strategy would be to assume that Biden voters and universal care supporters are one and the same, that all Biden voters are universal care supporters, and that all universal care supporters are Biden voters. But this means to pass universal care, we would actually have to get 98% of Biden voters would have to support universal care in order just to get to 50-50, which, by the way, is not a great place to be. Is 98% support for universal care among Biden voters realistic? No, we already know that at least 20 to 30% of Biden supporters are in favor of something more incremental or in favor of the ACA. And even less support have even less support when you ask about the funding. So even in a bimodal distribution, the winning target zone still requires teaming up with some voters to the right of centers, in this case, needing to team up with some Trump voters who support universal care. So thinking about the most simple form of a bimodal situation, we could draw the winning target zone like this, but this isn't quite right. It's since it's actually the more centrist Biden voters who oppose universal care, the target zone gets weirder looking because we need to target the more progressive wing of both of these groups. And what this shows, incidentally, is that curves drawn according to party orientation or according to candidate vote are not always going to look the same as curves based on support for specific issues. And I'd like to point out that if these curves were overlaid onto each other, combination would roughly match the single bell curve, which I started with. So no matter how the curve is drawn, it shows us a challenge. Do universal care advocacy organizations cover the full winning target zone? And if not, how can that be remedied? So I'll actually call on Mike to put people in breakout rooms and to discuss the question, do advocate groups have sufficient coverage of the winning target zone? And if not, how do we fix that?
Thank you. And Marcia, what did your group come up with?
So our group said no. The answer was no to the first question. And what can be done about it? We mentioned mentioning with the benefits that business could see from a universal healthcare system, and zeroed in on education, how approaching teachers and school boards would be the way to go to convince those people.
Thank you. And Lauren?
Our group kind of across the board said no, they hadn't really seen much business support of any of their efforts. And we did go around and it seemed like most of us have been working at least 3 to 5 years and even some up to 10 or 11 years. But there was a mention that when Maine had a ballot initiative for it, that in Maine, they did see some business support of the ballot measure. So I guess that's a glimmer of hope.
Thank you. Thank you. And Walter?
I think we were pretty much with what everyone, the people in the other groups have said. We talked about small businesses are in favor of it more. We talked about trying to form relationships with them, get them into the table to talk about it. We discussed how about like Main Street Alliance, a group I'm familiar with in Vermont. This gentleman was from Minnesota, and how much small businesses are in favor of it because it would alleviate much of the paperwork that they have to do and the benefit issues. But again, we're at about 50-50.
Thank you, Walter. And Alan?
Thank you. Of course, no. And we discussed that the concerns of businesses will vary amongst the size of the business. And it would be good to find an important area of concern, sometimes based on the size or the type of business, and then meeting with them in some forum to explain how a single payer system could actually meet their expectations, providing either more competitiveness or better security, or a better benefit for their employees to make them more attractive to employees.
Great, thank you, Alan.
Sure.
Okay, Warren.
Thank you. Going back to screen share here. Here, yep. I'll just read these questions and you can think about the answers. Compared with the rest of the population, are business owners more satisfied or less satisfied with their current healthcare system? And question number 2, what percentage of business owners and self-employed support universal care? And you can think about those answers and kind of those questions and listen to the next segment to get some answers. So we've kind of all agreed that we want business support. And one of the useful things then is to know the mind of business owners and leaders. And in July of 2019, along with Ron Lowe, a fellow Republican businessman in Oregon, we commissioned the Elway research poll of Oregon voters. About 14% of the respondents identified themselves as business owners or self-employed. Following the slides, we'll concentrate on how their answers to the specific questions in the poll compare to other respondents. So we'll start with how are they the same and how are they different? To start out with, what do they see as the problems? And they see very strongly cost and complexity. 89% of business owners and self-employed says cost was a major problem, compared with only 80% of the general poll respondents. Complexity the same, 79% thought it was a major problem, compared with only 69% of the general populations. Here's one that's interesting. Their concerns about fair access and things like medical bankruptcy were virtually identical to the general population, as was their concerns about how to keep Medicare and Medicaid financially viable. Business owners are unsurprisingly less likely to be covered by an employer policy. Some business owners may be covered by their own company's employee plan. Others may be covered by a plan from a spouse's employer. Because many business owners and self-employed have relatively low income. Almost 1 in 5 are on the Oregon Health Plan, Oregon's Medicaid program. They are 2.5 times more likely to be on Medicaid compared with the population at large. And they're about twice as likely to have no medical insurance at all. For a combination of reasons, they expressed even less satisfaction with our current system. Their income runs the gambit from low to high compared with private and public employees. Unlike private and public employees, annual income for business owners and self-employed can vary significantly from year to year, with people in the upper third one year and then in the bottom third the next. So what do they see as the solution? A strong majority think the universal care is desirable. This is less than the other poll respondents, but it's interesting to me that that 64% was more loyal support than the 77%. I found that progressives and other supporters tended to drop their support the more information that was given, particularly about financing, whereas business and self-employed on the general questions actually stayed pretty loyal to the concept. In fact, 61% of owners and self-employed polled in favor of a publicly funded healthcare system operated by a state agency. Let me repeat that. 61% for publicly funded healthcare system operated by a state agency. Business people are among the most affected by healthcare high cost and complexity, and that may be what's driving the high support. Like many states, Oregon is partly urban blue, partly rural red. Oregon's District 2, shown here ironically in blue on the map, voted nearly 2-to-1 for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton in 2016, and by a similarly wide margin for Trump in 2020, while the rest of the state was voting for Hillary in 2016 and Joe Biden in 2020. And yet, in the Elway poll, Oregon's solid red District 2 voters polled 55% to 35% in favor of state universal care program, even if it was 2 to 3 times the size of the entire state budget. Majority support for universal care funded by a state healthcare tax held across all 5 of Oregon's 5 congressional districts. And the support for universal care was almost as high in the district which supported Trump as it was in the districts which supported Clinton and Biden. When you look at where the support for universal care is coming from in the Oregon poll, 56% of the support for universal care came from unaffiliated Republican and third-party voters, actually leaving traditional Democratic supporters in the minority. So now we're going to move on to how does our language, how is our language different from business and self-employed? In the poll, survey respondents were asked to give in their own words, why does healthcare cost so much more in the United States? Then Stuart Elway grouped similar answers together so that they could be tracked by subgroups. So here is, on the left, is what progressives said. The words favored by progressives were profit, greed, and insurance companies. In their answers, progressives tended to use the word profit as an insult synonymous with greed, and this differentiates them from business owners who are offended by the use of the word profit in that way. That's how they are paid for their work and how they buy groceries. Meanwhile, the words favored by business owners and self-employed were waste, utilization issues, and system inefficiencies. So what kinds of differences do you see between these choices of words? And Betty, I'd like you to call on people who think that they see some difference and might like to comment on that.
Another phrase that would appeal to business is economies of scale. I mean, we always saw, you always see businesses that are inefficient merging to gain economies of scale by combining, putting their eggs together into a larger basket. And I always thought that economies of scale would be a good argument to use with business.
Thank you. I could see that as fitting in with the system inefficiency. That's good. Thank you. And Jean, can you share your thoughts?
One of the things that I learned in reading about it, first of all, we don't have a real system. We just have a patchwork. So it's extremely inefficient, and people don't seem to realize that the reason that we're paying so much for healthcare and getting so little is that the regular person who has healthcare and is paying for it, but through their taxes, they're paying again for healthcare for people who don't have coverage through county hospitals and emergency rooms and all of those things. So it's very inefficient. and it's not portable, which is another reason it's not efficient. If you lose your job, you lose your health care. So those are some of the reasons that it doesn't work. And I think a lot of people are not aware of why it's so expensive in this country.
Thank you, Jean.
What I see, Warren, is a narrative from the others and a narrative from the business owners. And when I see that this is so disparate, one as compared to the other, I don't want to argue the narrative. I want to go back to policy. And the policies, I think, as an employer and employee are similar as it relates to freedom, security, and justice. That's where the common ground is that I have found. And I want to learn if you have that same experience, or should we sort of argue the narratives?
That's very interesting. It's really two different worldviews when you look at this. The progressives are speaking more morally, you might say, the greedy, profit maximizing insurance companies, and the business guys, as you might expect, are looking at issues of value. Are we wasting resources, utilization? Are we producing things inefficiently? So it's just a really different worldview.
So thanks for those answers. And, a little bit of what I see here is that what I've seen a lot of the others, and these are actually a progressive comparison, using the words on the left to beat business owners and self-employed over the head. But those words are not very effective. I think there are some other comparisons of these words, of why one set of words is different than the other. One is kind of subjective, one is objective, one is kind of others directed at other people or other entities, and one is very system focused. And this is this is a kind of example of two people who have a different vocabulary and really need to kind of come to understand the difference in vocabulary. So I'll move on quickly, and we can talk more about this later. It turns out in the poll that nobody likes pharmaceutical companies. And significantly and very problematically for agreement on universal care, while most progressives blame insurance companies and trust government, almost no business owners and self-employed people blame insurance companies, but instead many do blame government regulations for the high cost of healthcare. So in the context of the winning target zone, we can see some opportunities and some challenges. And with the remaining time in the first section, I'd like to just kind of open the floor for discussions, any questions that you have of me, and then we'll begin the second session at 6 o'clock for people who want to stick around. That you really have to understand that there is a difference in narrative here. And it's a true difference. And that unless you are coming up with a narrative that works for both, you're going to have skew lines. You're not going to be really on the same page.
Warren, how would you go after the reservations of government intervention or the government control and the businesses' reservations over that?
That is a beautiful question, and I think that is the number one question of how you deal with these two groups, both of which may want universal care, but how do you design a system? I think government, I think Colorado did a good job of trying to separate the two issues by having a quasi-governmental agency instead of a direct governmental agency. I think it can be attacked in some ways just by, I think in most ways, I just don't believe it's true. But the fact is that we do have lots of examples where government has disappointed us, let's say in some way, and there's no getting around that. So you have to kind of figure out how to design a system that is trustworthy and transparent. And in Oregon, one of the things that we can use is the state accident insurance fund is actually for workers' compensation is run by by a quasi-state agency, and it's very well thought of. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of an example that there are examples that you can hold up as favorable, but it's a real problem. I think many of the arguments that I've heard by business owners are probably a little bit exaggerated about the problems of government. And there may be, besides just being exaggerated, there are examples of other things in their life. Everything in business is, takes a lot of paperwork or something, and they resent that. And so they say, oh, this is just going to be more incompetent people coming in and to tell me to do stupid things or something, and it's going to cost more. But you, I think, have hit on the number one question of how do you design a system that's going to be pleasing.
Or talk to businesses.
Thank you.
How do you talk to business people then when you don't have a program set up yet and you have a government program in mind?
Yeah, we won't have any silver magic bullets, but we will talk a little bit more about how to do that and the importance of and the way that you do that.
And when you talk about quasi-state agency, is that a public-private partnership? Is that kind of idea, or?
No, not exactly. What happened in Oregon was back in, I think, the late 60s or 70s, sometime. That was in the previous century for young people who might be listening. They couldn't actually get insurance companies who would compete in the workman's compensation arena. So the state had to step in, create its own agency, and so it's has its own board and things like that. But the state doesn't mind picking the pockets sometime of the. But that's another matter.
I've worked as a healthcare reformer in putting together a business plan for insurance companies. And what I found was that the evil within that system is the fragmentation of the system and the complexity. And I've worked as an employer and also as an employee, and I found the same thing. And that's what I want to talk about. And based on your analysis, Warren, I appreciate that. The business person looks at the fragmentation and complexity. For God's sake, let's look at it and put together a plan.
Yeah, I am not a business person, and those words profit and what have you resonate more with me, the derogatory meanings and connotations. But I wonder if it's because, people that like on my side, we don't understand the business language. So if we did understand the business language, we might be able to articulate our problems with the system the way it is right now much better. But I would like to get rid of the marketing setup with the healthcare system, get rid of that completely. Businesses understand that highways exist, that's provided by the government. There are certain public services provided by the government, and businesses, I'm sure, understand that as well. I am aware that there are some business people that are fully in favor of Medicare for all, especially some that have worked in Canada and have come over here to the United States. So I'm just wondering if we can meet on common ground somewhere that way, instead of, attacking the profits and what have you, maybe focus on making it a public service or a public good that the government pays for.
I'd like to just focus on one thing that you said, Paul, and that is that I do find that a lot of advocates really don't know a lot about bookkeeping, about business bookkeeping. And I think, there's a saying by Graham Greene, English playwright, when more is understood, more is forgiven. And I think, and this is a case where I think if people understood more about about what business means when they say certain things or what their problems are, I think it would be a kind of synergistic experience.
Thank you much. So we have Pam Gronemeyer and Samuel Metz.
Hi, Warren. I really actually liked your poll just because I'm a physician and I own a small histology pathology business and I provide my employees health insurance. But just like many of those business owners, when I started my plan, I had a plan for my group, but because it cost me so much because I was getting older, I eventually went back to my husband's insurance because it was cheaper. So I had planned for my employees, but I had to go on another plan. But I just think that your data was really good about telling about small businesses or businesses being really interested in it. And don't you think partially the reason they're upset about government regulations is what the government regulations are doing to their business? Because quite honestly, as a physician, I'd much rather deal with the government, with the regulations that Medicare makes me. We don't have to have all this hoopla about filling out bills and applying for everything to get payments from everybody. Then Medicare is so much simpler. But I think probably, they're more worried because they see the government regulations on their business. But in medicine, it would be better, I think, in my opinion.
Thank you, Pam. And we have Sam Metz and then Walter Carpenter.
Thank you. Warren, if I understood what you were saying, to condense a lot of it, there's a surprisingly high support for universal care amongst business people, but the support is for different reasons and using a different vocabulary. And if we don't understand their reasons, we're going to end up insulting them for trying to run a for-profit business. We don't have to, again, projecting, we don't have to tell them why they support it. They already know it. It's our job to understand why they support it and reinforce their support. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that. I think one of the things that the poll shows to me, that there is a certain amount of support there that is, we're not having to convince these people that we have a problem. But they're, and we'll talk more about this in the next session, they are unlikely to join progressive organizations to support universal care.
That's interesting.
Betty, if we could just take one more and then I'll close up this session.
And I've always wondered why we cannot get small business support in this. We've used all the languages, everything everybody's talked about here, we've done it before. And I was on the campaign in Colorado in 2016 as well. And again, businesses, small and large, did not support us. So I'm wondering why, based on Warren's survey, that we can't get businesses to go into the state houses with us and say, we want to tell our politicians who are being well paid by the insurers, we want universal care for a year out. And that's the one thing, that's the one piece we can't seem to get.
Okay, we'll
figure that
talk
out.
about that just a little bit more in the second hour. I did want to let everybody know.
Quick comment about the vocabulary. In the whole issue, I've always resented when people said free public education. As a teacher, it's not free. It's not free public health. We pay for it through our taxes and through the way that we organize it. And I think there's not enough education around how things are paid for. So that's an issue for me.
Thank you, Jean.
Good point.
Thank you. So everybody stand up. You got like, 3 minutes or so, and then we're gonna want to get started on the other one because it's getting late over here on the East Coast.